just looking back over your career, what was something that really stands out to you is, that's kind of a game changer and maybe something you think about from time to time, or maybe something that actually resonated to the point that you pivoted as a result of it. It's actually changed your trajectory and path a little bit in a good way.
It's a great question. I think one of the big lessons, you kind of alluded to sort of lean into your strengths, but lean into your intuition on things.
Okay.
There've been some times where things felt risky, but they also felt like there's a nugget of connection there. Um, and at the time, for example, the mid '90s, travel to the former Soviet Union
Mhm.
was, people thought I was crazy,
Uh,
and it was admittedly a risk, but it was also a time in a company's trajectory. There was a time in the historical arc where there seemed to be something there, that there was both an opportunity and a need, and
okay.
we had a company with a vision that was sort of filling that need, and that you know I think that believing in that and feeling strong enough to say I can go do this, I got this.
Mhm.
That's sort of a big win to, I think, get across that inertia that we put in front of ourselves sometimes, and just believing, hey, that feels right, I should do it,
Mhm. Mhm.
and not being afraid that there's something I'm going to lose out on. I'm going to lose. I mean, you hear a lot in
Uh-huh.
today's generation about this fear of missing out, right? This FOMO, and
Yep.
and
FOMO.
I kind of get where that can come from, but at the same time, if you don't try things, by definition, you lose out or you miss out. Or on the golf analogy, 100% of all putts not hit hard enough do not go in,
Exactly.
right? So don't be shy about giving it a look, giving it a run.
Exactly. Yeah, I love it.
So that, I don't know if you call that really a win, but that then opened up, I think, more confidence to take other, sort of risky moves to say,
Mhm.
okay, well, I've done this before. I've done something like this. I can
Uh,
figure out a new structure of people, a new system of economics, a new set of market rules. And I did. I ended up in South America for a couple of years. I was in Chile,
mhm.
ran AES's large generation business there. I was in El Salvador for almost 9 months,
Okay.
helping sort of restructure some businesses there.
Mhm.
So it's, I think big wins are sometimes realizing what you can do.
Welcome to the Inner Genius Podcast with Joe Pastor Ford.
I want to welcome everyone to another episode of the Inner Genius Podcast. I'm excited to be back today. I've got a fantastic guest. I was finally able to get him on the show today. We got Rob Morgan. Rob, good to have you on.
Hey, Joe. Good morning. Nice to be here. Good to see you.
Thank you. You as well. Yeah. Well, I'm excited. I got to be honest. So when I put together the podcast and I had my top 10 list of people I wanted on, Rob was on the top 10. So I'm super excited he's going to be with us today and talk a little bit about the energy infrastructure, low carbon, et cetera. Rob is incredibly experienced, has done a number of really, I would say, fascinating things throughout your career. So you've got a lot of good stuff to give. I'm excited to kind of pull it apart so we can all hear the nuggets that you have to offer, but super excited you can make some time to be with us today. One of the things I want to talk about up front is give us a little bit on your background, kind of where did you grow up and
Mhm.
how did you get into the space that you're in? I think these are always fascinating stories on how people ended up where they are, at this point in their life.
Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction, Joe. And thanks for that little bit of flattery there. I'm glad to finally make it onto the show with you. So I know we've been trying for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, going back a little bit, I would say one of the anchor points of my background is my upbringing in a military family. My father was a submarine officer in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, and so that sort of anchored us around both a life that changed. I mean, we moved around. Every couple of years you have a new station and you've got a new place to figure out, a new set of rules, if you will, a new set of market rules. You got a dynamic shift to figure out. And so that actually played a very large role, sort of in preparing me for a life in new markets and evolving new markets. We spent, being a submariner, we obviously were by the coasts, and I have to thank the U.S. Navy for some spectacular geographies, places from San Diego to Hawaii to Seattle, Washington, San Francisco Bay Area,
Right.
and even got to go overseas with the military. My father was stationed in a small island off of Sardinia and Corsica in the Mediterranean. So,
Oh,
like I
wow.
say, really, really great geographies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that sort of took me, I consider myself a native Californian because of a lot of those intersection points. And I came back to college out in the Bay Area in California.
Mm,
And that really, strong part of my identity was coming back to that.
mm,
But as I looked for something to do with a college degree, I was sort of fascinated by the stories of economic development, whether they be capitalist or communist or things that had systemic changes. Sort of
mm.
fascinated by why did certain places evolve like they did? Why do cities exist where they are? Why do countries exist like they do? And so that brought me really to economic development or political development as
Mm.
well. And that intersection of sort of trade and human dynamic brought me to electricity as an infrastructure market as something that was really development oriented.
Okay.
I was able to use a college advisors connection back to people at AES, which at the time
Uh-huh.
was still called Applied Energy Services, a small burgeoning company based in Washington, D.C. And so my start really was moving into that company, working in both finance and project development that then spawned a whole universe of opportunities over the next 15 years. And that's really an anchor point for, I think, this conversation and my entry into the infrastructure space.
Yeah. Let me ask, that's really fascinating. I didn't know that backstory on you, I mean, some of the stuff that we've kind of teamed up over the years, but what, were you spending some time in DC, really on the finance economic side that led to coming out to the West Coast, deregulation and kind of really assessing what the market was doing at the time, Enron, right? I guess that was a good word to say back then. Kind of exploring deregulation, et cetera. So did you dovetail kind of at the beginning of that, a little before?
Yes, the story of AES starts with the Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA. That
Okay.
was a late 70s, 80s law that allowed independent power generating companies and assets to enter what was traditionally a vertically integrated utility space.
Right.
So I like to tell the story of my overall career, sort of followed the arc of these deregulation events, both within the US and around the world. PURPA was a big one that allowed these non-utility generators, or IPPs, to
Sure.
exist. We had subsequent iterations of deregulation in the US, the Energy Policy Act of 95. There were subsequent amendments or restatements of that in 2005, I guess.
Uh-huh.
At the same time, there were a lot of things happening, and this is all kind of before that Enron period. I'll get to that, but there was a whole wave of things that were happening around the world,
Okay.
started by the UK in the late 80s, early 90s, but
Uh-huh.
accelerated by the breakup of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
I had studied Russian in college as well, so I had a little snippet of learning in the Russian language. But when the former Soviet countries began to break apart and Eastern Europe began to break apart, they found these very sort of developed infrastructure economies with no market mechanisms to support their ongoing operation. And
Oh,
they didn't flourish. So they really were broken countries for a lot of things. AES stepped into that void in a number of countries in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And I recall really specifically, we had signed this option in Kazakhstan to buy a big power plant and refurbish it. And
okay.
we had one of these annual events at AES. We call them business and technical conferences. People gathered. It was both a networking event, but also a learning event and tie people together, a very strong culture at AES.
Okay.
And we were playing pool after hours. And our CEO is notorious for recruiting people at these little after hour networking events. He comes over to me and my group that was playing pool, which included my wife, who also started AES before I did. And she tells him, Dennis, Rob speaks some Russian. And I looked over like, are you trying to get me sent off to Siberia or something? And in fact, later that year, I did end up going off and spending a couple of years in the former Soviet Union, helping to sort of advance the ball, meaning buying assets, starting the refurbishment process, buying additional assets,
Right.
helping to rethink the commercial structures, et cetera. So that was one, I'd say, tentacle of where deregulation went around the world.
Okay.
At the end of that, I did come back to the
Sure.
US. And at that time, the deregulation of the retail side of electricity had really taken hold in the late 90s. And so I was in California. We did participate as AES in that retail deregulation. We bought a company called New Energy Ventures at the time.
Okay. Okay.
That company has persisted. It's now probably the largest retail provider in North America. It flourished under the brands of Constellation and Exelon. And I think
Okay.
that along the way, the new energy label is slowly faded, but it's a very large retail provider. And that was an early entry that AES did that was quite interesting. The Enron part and the California energy crisis, which was really a structural problem.
Hmm.
We can put aside for later that, Texas just showed a structural problem last week that
Right. Right.
they thought they didn't have or didn't want to acknowledge.
Yeah.
Anyways, California, the Enron and the structural problem dovetailed together to create quite a mess for a couple of years there, and some bankruptcies, et cetera.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. What's interesting, I mean, I think of, I guess the deregulation, I think of kind of here in the United States, and not having had a lot of global experience myself, right? And just, I guess, fail to see, recognize, or understand for that matter that, these types of realities do happen in other places. That's really cool. I mean, you kind of had that experience, coming back to the U.S. So I would had to think that gives you a step ahead in a lot of ways. I mean, there's things that you're going to see play out that you've already seen happen. Kind of the red flags and whatnot, see around corners to kind of have that competitive advantage. Let's talk about a little bit today. What do you got going on today? I mean, I know you got your hands in a couple of different things, and you're always staying super busy. So what's kind of ramping us up to where we are now? What's going on? What are you working on right now?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting right now. I'm a senior advisor to Quinbrook Infrastructure Partners right
Uh-huh.
now. And this comes after a couple of years as the CEO of GE's energy storage business, which was a great experience, really interesting
Mhm.
time in a company that was going through its own set of challenges and turmoil. And so a lot of learning there.
Mhm.
What I've always been interested, as you alluded to, looking at what is coming next. And we've been through these waves. It started with the fairly traditional, the fossil deregulation,
Sure.
coal and gas and things. It went into structural deregulation, where you broke apart retail from supply and from transmission. But the rise of renewables really started around that time, 2000. The last 20 years have really
Uh-huh.
seen that rise of renewables. And wind was an early winner, and solar then had a very dominant shift and has taken over. As I mentioned, I was part of energy storage leadership at GE, and I've seen energy storage over the last 7 or 8 years evolving. And it's evolving to longer and longer durations. It's making itself more available into other technologies, but it's also just a pattern that's leading us towards a deeper decarbonization. And so as I think about the decarbonization of society, the electricity sector is a big portion, but we have other large sectors, transportation, obviously, and then you start to talk about industries that, whether it's refining or metals or glass or fertilizer, all these things that are very carbon intensive industries.
Mhm.
How do we
Mhm.
decarbonize broadly? Electrification is a great tool for decarbonizing. Anything that burns fuel, it can be electrified. It's a great, it's a great place to start. But
Yeah.
there are a lot of things where electrification is quite hard, whether it's due to uh, density of the fuel and therefore your mobility. We think about airplanes. It's hard to
Sure.
electrify large airplanes. Smaller airplanes, we see a lot of activity happening.
Right. Right.
Vehicles is happening, right? The light vehicle fleet is going to be
Yeah.
electric. But you have these other things. You got maritime. You got
Yeah.
heavy trucking, long distance trucking. You got airplanes, things like that. You do have these big chemical processes that are very dependent on molecules. You can't stick electricity in the ground to make fertilizer, right? To
Right. Right.
make plants grow. That I know of.
Yeah.
We'll see. So all this is a long lead up to saying the hydrogen economy is really starting to take some root, and I'm seeing a lot of potential opportunities in the hydrogen space.
Mhm.
What's great is you're seeing very large strategics adopting a forward view, and I think part of that is strategic threat that the oil majors see decarbonizing their fuel as an existential issue.
Okay.
But it's good. They're doing pilots. They're doing projects.
Yep.
They're creating the demand there. You have some really innovative market structures, like California has created this low carbon fuel standard, low carbon fuel credit, that
Mhm.
actually incentivizes the supply side to move first, which is always a chicken and egg type problem.
Right.
And so
Right.
you get sort of credits for capacity, and then if there's demand there, you can really monetize those. So
Right.
I think you're now seeing some European countries also put some of these incentivized or market structures in place to get more green fuels happening, all along with a huge move towards electrification. But electrification brings a lot of supply side constraints, and I think
Mhm.
as a society, we need to acknowledge that as we move towards decarbonized electricity, we need to figure out how to make our systems and our networks more robust and more resilient as well. So there's a lot of themes that tie together. The decarbonization is the underlying theme, but it gets to how do you make the electricity system more robust, storage and resilience? How do you make your fuel system lower carbon, hydrogen, which also can be storage? So there's a lot of connection points there.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you kind of gave me a broader view, and when you look at so with Quinbrook, are you guys looking at all the different markets? You're focusing more on electricity, as you mentioned. Do you look at kind of the broad scope and saying, there's probably 10, 12 ways to go at this. They're all very different and unique, but they're all ripe at the same time.
Yeah, I think the themes really would get to that low carbon or decarbonized power system as a core. Our geographic markets are really the UK, Australia, and North America. And so I'm really part of the North American team and help the Houston-based team quite a bit.
Okay.
But as we think about that low carbon universe, it now picks up a lot of things.
Okay.
We like to create opportunities where there are assets to invest in. So we get to put investment dollars into cash flowing assets and create sustainable return for our shareholders and for our partners.
Okay.
We're looking now to go beyond just the core of power assets. That's one set of assets, but I like to think of it as a concentric circle going out from those power assets.
Okay.
What industries are already electric and are growing rapidly that want to buy green power? That's one set of interesting intersections there.
Yeah.
What industries can electrify that might not already be electrified and are growing rapidly? And then what industries are really growing rapidly that maybe need to electrify or decarbonize that haven't got there yet?
Right.
So there's all these different ways to think about that. But our thesis right now is that if you can combine the load side, somebody who's naturally wants to be consuming power, therefore can consume low carbon power, how do you put that load together with the generation in a way that makes a more valuable equation, a more valuable piece of pie, if you will, more levers to pull on how to add value there. And sometimes that means your load can be dispatchable. And if your load's dispatchable or controllable, then you can actually move in the market in response to price signals.
Absolutely.
Storage can help you move things by a couple hours here and there. That's very valuable. If we can find some cost-effective and technically feasible long duration storage, and a lot of people working on longer duration storage, now we're talking about how do we shift energy consumption from hour to hour to day to week to even season to season, where we see great variability and therefore a much stronger system if we can do that.
Okay. That's really fascinating. I mean, you're opening my eyes up to all kinds of interesting topics and thoughts here. One of the things you said, I want to kind of just jump back to real quick before we kind of hit the next set of questions here. But you mentioned hydrogen. And do you think hydrogen sort of by default, sometimes it's just like pecking order, like if you're the third kid in line, parents didn't make the same mistakes with them as they might have the first, because they got their seasoned experience by that point in time. So I kind of wonder, do you think hydrogen benefits from having seen, the wind and the solar, and now the battery storage is coming on pretty strong, as, this is a safe place to go in terms of investment dollars and the way in which the market will embrace the opportunity, although it's new I say it's not really new per se, but it's kind of a new foray. But because the successes have been strong in the renewable space, I'd say for the last 20 plus years, by default, it's just an easier pill to swallow, so to speak. Are you seeing that? I mean, it's a little easier to kind of move into it.
I think you're onto something there. Structurally, I think people have really bought in that with scale, you're going to see, price improvements, and it happened in semiconductors, but then we saw the same curves drawn for wind, for solar, for energy storage in the form of batteries. And as you double a manufacturing capacity, you're sort of cutting your costs in half, or a rough ratio that looks like that.
Right.
And these learning curves have been persistent now in industries, and they might be a little, different, not as steep here, not as steep there. But I think that brings the mindset to, okay, making electrolyzers, which will become one of the dominant green hydrogen production technologies, using electricity to split water. Yeah. People can see now that, if we're making a 1 megawatt size machine today and make a 10 megawatt machine, if we go from 100 megawatts of capacity to 10 gigawatts of capacity, we're going to see some big scale economies that are going to help us there. So I think that mechanism is widely acknowledged now. So I think there's an investment horizon that says, okay, we're going to see, we can draw a line now. It's going to be from $3 to $1, whatever. I'm just using sort of imaginary units there, but we're going to see some massive improvements. That's going to bring us to a point where it's really interesting as a price point. So I think there is that fundamental buy-in.
Okay.
I think there's been a couple of false starts with hydrogen over the last 20, 30 years.
Okay.
And something feels much different now. I think that finally, you can talk about the Paris Agreement, or the U.S. re-entering, or the fact that China's kind of acknowledging that carbon needs to be a part of their strategic plan as well.
Okay.
I think there is some real momentum this time, and I believe by watching the oil majors really invest and buy in, that's a signal as well that they're not going to be a block. And I think in the past, they've been a bit of a blocker on some things that they don't like. This one seems to be in their favor. And like I said earlier, there's a bit of an existential question for some of the big refiners and folks that are based on, hydrocarbons. They now see that the hydro part of that needs a lot more attention.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think when oil and gas really steps in, that's not insignificant. I would agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
Let's mix it up a little bit. So talk to me, what's it like? What's it like being Rob Morgan for a day? Walk us through the day. How do you get the day kicked off? How do you move through the day? What does a typical day for you look like? Just, work and family and, balance, exercise, whatever it is.
Yeah, it's a fair question. The pandemic has really sort of changed that answer, I think. And so
It's true.
we've all evolved into a little bit of a different routine. The last 5 years before March of 2020, my routine would have required me to say, get up Monday morning or maybe Sunday night. I've gone to the airport and gone someplace else for a couple of days.
Right. Travel.
Now it's a lot steadier, and so it's a pretty regular, boring routine right now. You can only see sort of my fake office behind me here, because my regular office is got a bunch of monitors on the wall. It's kind of messy. So it does usually entail, since I'm on the West Coast, I start off a little bit behind the news cycle. So I like to jump in on news to see what's happened for the course of the day. Sure. I get a pretty good news feed from my Twitter account. I'm an old Yahoo kind of guy, so I still have a nice Yahoo page that's set up for me the way I like it.
Okay.
I read the Wall Street Journal and go through a little morning routine.
Okay.
Get into email, and it's a regular set of calls and things that are scheduled.
Sure.
And then once sort of get that most of the morning over, I start to dig in more subject matter wise and try to go pick on particular projects or spend some time digging through some of the things that are on the plate right now.
Mm-hmm.
I've been trying to get a regular workout in.
Sure.
My wife and I like to get out since we live on the West Coast now, and have found the LA beaches to be very accessible. And sunsets are kind of every day is a new surprise, a new gift. We like to get out, and got a couple of favorite spots near here that we can walk out on the beach for sunset. So beautiful. That's kind of the routine. And we got a high school daughter. We like to spend the evenings doing stuff with her. And during the pandemic, we found a couple of, binge-worthy shows that we watch an episode or two a night that, gets the family all together as well.
Excellent. No, it's good. I appreciate you sharing that. And you said something I want to kind of dovetail into just for a second. So you're on the West Coast, and did you get up a little earlier to catch some of the feed that's happening on the East Coast to get a little bit of a jump? That was one thing I heard. And then when liaising with the guys in Australia, how does that work for you for time wise as well? I mean, how do you structure those two?
Yeah. So I have to say I'm not a super early riser as far as doing like the East Coast market opening kind of thing, but 6, 7 a.m. is sort of a reasonable time for us to be moving around here.
Yeah, that's okay. That's good. I like it.
The teenage daughter helps, I think, maybe moderate that a little bit. So
yeah, that's funny.
It is funny being I'm sort of in the middle of the UK and the Australia folks, and so
right.
In my morning, I can still catch the UK folks for their evening and night.
Okay.
And then as we turn the noon hour,
right.
It's still pretty late for the UK, but the Australians are getting up for tomorrow.
Right.
And so we spend the afternoon as needed working with the Australia team. So I find actually to be in the West Coast, it's a pretty good in-between spot for those two geographies. And obviously for them, the two partners of Quinbrook are UK and Brisbane, Australia based. And so they've got a couple hours a day they can catch, but that, it's a small window they have to work.
Right, right. Well, no, that's interesting. And I think you're right. Yeah. Being on the West Coast, I mean, I think it puts you in a sweet spot, certainly, for those two markets, if you will. The other thing you mentioned too, I thought was interesting. I read a book called Deep Work by Cal Newport. I thought it was an excellent read. And I got a lot out of it. Actually, that's where the idea for this whole podcast came from. Where do you spend your time really thinking and kind of pushing yourself cognitively to get the most out of what you got? And it sounds like kind of in the afternoon, is that kind of when you really dial in? That's when you try to maybe step away from email a little bit and really try to focus in an undistracted way to be precise, creative, that kind of thing.
It's probably that I've adapted that to my current circumstance because things kind of calm down from other people asking for my time.
Okay.
And even folks on the East Coast will, unless they need it, that they really will put things down 5, 6, 7 their time. And so that frees up my acting a little bit more than other times where I have to be a bit more, on call or ad hoc.
Right.
I do try to, use a headset or things that kind of like tune me into my direct surroundings if I can, and tune out stuff around me.
Okay. That was kind of something else I want to talk about is, when you talk about moving through the day and being able to kind of execute and certainly perform at the level that you're operating, what are some of the tools that you use? Are there different software packages? Are there different things that you use that you feel like have, give you an edge, a couple of things that you lean on every day as part of your process?
I'm a pretty basic, I'd say Microsoft Office advocate. I sort of grew up with those software tools. We had a couple of iterations before Microsoft really took over.
Uh-huh.
I go back to the day of Lotus, 1, 2, 3, and
Lotus
keystrokes and things. So
yeah,
I can still drive a spreadsheet with my fingers as opposed to the mouse. So the mouse kind of slows me down.
That's funny. That's funny. I love it.
I have found the video tools are good at making connections during this time.
Sure.
I've also had to adapt to a little bit of I'd say a dissonance for me, that not actually being able to look at somebody the same way and read them as quickly as you can in person.
Sure.
I find that a little bit sometimes disconcerting, and so you can misread body language and misread the room. So that it'd be nice when we get the camera like right in the middle of the screen,
Yeah.
And then you got a little more feel of what's going on. But
yeah.
different people are better at that than others. That's sort of me. I think the news feeds I do use. My kids think I'm boring for using LinkedIn. What's LinkedIn? Well, it's like Snapchat for adults. I don't know. But you don't snap. You don't do that. Twitter I found to be as good as you want it to be if you can follow things that are interesting, or you can also get distracted by a lot of other stuff.
Sure. Yeah.
And really, then it's just again about having a physical setup where you can get monitors and access to your information in a way that's not you're not having to scroll through something, but you can actually get it up and around you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, I like what you said. I mean, in some ways, what I'm hearing certainly is simplicity, but I think that's a strength, because I think as you keep it simple, keep it to a couple of things, it's easier to be consistent, and obviously consistency, from what I've experienced, that wins at the end of the day. So as you mentioned, the kind of the news feeds and just kind of keeping it simple, with the Microsoft Office, and lean into your strengths, right? If you're good at it and it, keep it going. Why make the change? So yeah, no, that's good. That's good. One of the things I always like to ask, and is, looking over your career, what do you think one of the biggest lessons learned was, right? Ending a sentence with a verb, I guess. But what was it whether it was a big win, maybe it was a big loss, I don't know. Some of my biggest aha moments sometimes came in kind of in defeat, but just looking back over your career, what was something that really stands out to you is, that's kind of a game changer, and maybe something you think about from time to time, or maybe something that actually resonated to the point that you pivoted as a result of it. It's actually changed your trajectory and path a little bit in a good way.
It's a great question. I think one of the big lessons, you kind of alluded to it, is sort of lean into your strengths, but lean into your intuition on things.
Okay.
There've been some times where things felt risky, but they also felt like there's a nugget of connection there. Um, and at the time, for example, the mid '90s, travel to the former Soviet Union
Mhm.
was, people thought I was crazy, and it was it was admittedly a risk, but it was also a time in a company's trajectory. There was a time in the historical arc where there seemed to be something there, that there was both an opportunity and a need, and
Okay.
we had a company with a vision that was sort of filling that need, and that you know I think that believing in that and feeling strong enough to say I can go do this, I got this.
Mhm.
That's sort of a big win to, I think, get across that inertia that we put in front of ourselves sometimes, and just get believing, hey, that feels right, I should do it,
Mhm. Mhm.
and not being afraid that there's something I'm going to lose out on. I'm going to lose. I mean, you hear a lot in
Uh-huh.
today's generation about this fear of missing out, right? This FOMO,
Yep.
and
FOMO.
I kind of get where that can come from, but at the same time, if you don't try things, by definition, you lose out or you miss out. Or in the golf analogy, 100% of all putts not hit hard enough do not go in,
Exactly.
right? So don't be shy about giving it a look, giving it a run.
Exactly. Exactly. I love it.
So that, I don't know if you call that really a win, but that then opened up, I think, more confidence to take other, sort of risky moves to say,
Mhm.
okay, well, I've done this before. I've done something like this. I can figure out a new structure of people, a new system of economics, a new set of market rules. And I did. I ended up in South America for a couple of years. I was in Chile,
Mhm.
ran AES's large generation business there. I was in El Salvador for almost 9 months,
Okay.
helping sort of restructure some businesses there.
Mhm.
So it's, I think big wins are sometimes realizing what you can do.
That's a great nugget. Honestly, I've never heard of that. I mean, the way you kind of framed it. I tell my kids all the time, get comfortable being uncomfortable. And
Yep.
I think there's a trajectory there. The more you put yourselves in positions that are uncomfortable, you do get more comfortable with it later. Or if you don't think that you're getting more comfortable, it's because the size of the uncertainty has grown, but your shoulders have also grown to be able to handle that as well, right?
Yeah.
So but I like what you're saying about the intuition. I mean, I think that's so true though. I mean, more you put yourself in that position, you can draw back on those wins, that the knowledge, the experience, and that, I mean, that undoubtedly, that momentum will certainly propel you forward. And you'll make
Mhm.
more better decisions, and I think that maybe the daunting aspect of, the risk profile associated with this endeavor, I think does begin to decrease by default over time. Yeah.
I think it's also capturing, if you can, capturing the learning from, why did my intuition lead me to that? Do I get data later that gives me some feedback to, like, say, why was I feeling that? Or why was I, thinking that way at the time with a
Mhm.
limited data set? Now I have more data. Can
Right.
I learn from that? And that's been an interesting, sort of self-investigation to go back and try to figure out why you had an initial reaction to something.
So with that being said, just looking back in your own career, I mean, how did that play out for yourself? As you're looking back and seeing, the moves that you made, utilizing the intuition, assessing the risk, how did that play out for you?
Well, it's led me to, I'd say, stay at kind of the forefront of new opportunities.
Okay.
Uh, you know, I would say that I wasn't an early mover into wind. That happened, and I was doing other things. I was watching, like, oh, but I was trying to make some of this solar work that, ultimately they did do quite well. And I moved back into wind when I was at RES for several years.
Okay. Mhm.
Um, I think that it's led me to keep exploring the frontier, and I like to think of that frontier as maybe a bit of a puzzle. There are pieces that have to fit together. How do we think about fitting them together? How can I participate in a way that both advances that industry, that hopefully is good for me, for my situation,
Right.
Um, and and so I guess I'm not afraid to keep trying to uncover the next thing, if you will, and can I participate in a meaningful way there? I've tried it as an entrepreneur,
Mhm.
trying to raise my own funds, and that was one pathway for several years. I've tried it going back into a big company like GE, where I thought they had a footprint and a set of advantages that could actually, give some life to a segment of the industry that needed sort of the bigger footprint. They each have had their successes and their failures in some way. Um, I think sometimes with age, you also get a little bit more tolerant of saying, well, I'm going to please myself, really. I don't need to
Yeah.
make somebody else happy here.
Yeah.
Um, and so it does give you a freedom to go explore things and try to figure something out
Yeah.
that fits your own set of goals.
Yeah. As you're saying that, one of the things that kind of went through my mind is because you've, followed the intuition, you've leaned into the risk, and, you've seen things play out as they've played out. Right. And you've seen, I would say, a lot of successes in the process. I almost feel, that's a great nugget for this show too. I mean, anybody listening, I think hold on to that, because what I think typically could happen is someone could, be at that stage, kind of step one, see the situation for what it is, maybe get a little skittish, maybe it's a little anxiety, maybe I'm not certain, right? There's a pregnant pause, and maybe nothing happens, or maybe it happens too slow, where, someone like yourself sees that same situation, and I mean, you're 50 yards down the field before they take the first step. I don't think that's insignificant, right? I mean, I think that chasm, because of the work that you've done, um, is a massive competitive advantage than I would say to most people, or certainly anybody looking at it for the first time. So I don't think it's a small difference. I think it's a profound difference. I think it's a paradigm shift. That's good. I always learn stuff on this show. That's something I'll be taking to my next deep work session. I can assure everybody watching this. So,
That's excellent.
well, with that being said, I know we're kind of getting here towards the end. Talking about a little predictiveness here. What do you see in your space? Looking at low carbon emission. Looking at the markets that we're seeing. Obviously, got a new administration here in this country. Let's just say over the next 5 years, or pick a time frame that you're comfortable with. But where do you see things moving? I mean, what's kind of on your radar?
Um, so I do see that we are going to continue this massive build out of renewable electricity resources.
Okay.
I think across the world, solar has shown itself to be the lowest cost, marginal electricity supply unit.
Okay.
It's very predictable across the course of a day. You can see weather coming that's going to impact your solar supply more so than you can for wind. The wind variability,
Okay.
even day ahead forecasting, still trickier.
Okay.
But you see that we have days with load, we have weeks with load where you may not have
Mhm.
those renewable resources at your easy disposal. So one, I do see we're going to move towards a more interconnected system everywhere we can. Just like with your information network, more nodes makes a stronger network. Electricity is no different.
Okay.
It's just information. It's just electrons.
Okay.
So we need stronger network infrastructure. What that means to me is less point-to-point monolithic infrastructure like we built before. We used to build big power plants to go put them out of sight, put them someplace else, put them 100 miles away, put them 1,000 miles away.
Yep. No.
That necessarily leads to, I'd say, weaker big radial infrastructure as
Yep.
opposed to web infrastructure. So
Yep.
renewables is going to mean you got to have a stronger network. Intermittency means you need to have more resilience, redundancy, storage becomes the obvious connection there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean 1 hour or 2 hours of storage. I mean something that fundamentally changes what we're doing. So what can storage be? Well, there's electrochemical storage, that's batteries. There's been mechanical storage, it's called pumped hydro.
Okay.
A lot of mature economies, pumped hydro is sort of built out in a way that you're not going to have new opportunities. And even the ones you do have came with their consequences 30, 40, and 50 years ago of massive land use issues. So what else can you do in that mechanical space? People are using, concrete, or using air, things that you can move or compress to try to extract energy.
Okay.
So I think you're going to see a number of developments in different kinds of longer duration storage. And they will be in each of those, electrochemical as well as more mechanical storage ideas. That, though, still stays within my electricity realm. And so as I start to see the crossover, I think you'll see that fuel is storage as well. And just like you use gasoline in a car, that's your storage, right?
Okay.
Diesel in trucks or jet fuel in planes, those are heavily carbonized fuels. So how do you think of decarbonizing the fuel, where fuel is going to be a persistent part of the infrastructure, where you can actually reuse infrastructure, not have to create from whole cloth a whole new set of distribution. So hydrogen fits in that pretty well. Most existing gas systems can accommodate some fraction of hydrogen with no change to the pipelines and no change to the end use. People argue whether that's 10% or 20%. It's in that range with really no impact.
Wow.
No change to what we do today,
Wow.
and no change by end use behavior.
Okay.
But if we're going to go to the kind of carbon targets that scientists believe will help us stabilize, what climate change means, and climate change doesn't mean global warming. I really don't like to see that. And people have a deep freeze in Texas, and they say so much for global warming.
Yeah.
And you say that fundamentally is missing the point that carbon is changing the atmosphere in ways that we can't predict. And you're getting to have frequency of storms and events that freeze Texas for a week. Well,
Yeah.
it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So it's a weird event, and we
Yeah.
don't like weird events in that sense. And
Yeah.
people have evolved over time to live and work in places where we don't like weird events.
Yep.
So anyways, long way of saying decarbonizing that system where you've already got infrastructure, I think really is going to be happening. And moving towards sort of the newer infrastructure, I think is a long third leg off, because there's so much to do in those first two steps.
Okay. So taking those ideas and kind of the runway for them to play out, it's going to be a while. I mean, ultimately, yeah.
Faster than you think. I think just like people underestimated how quickly that wind cost curve and that solar cost curve and that battery cost curve have dropped. It's happening with things like the electrolysis for making hydrogen. It's happening with other technology advances. And so I think you're going to see material changes in the next 5 years.
Wow. Okay.
And you'll see things start to happen and go, okay, that's what it's going to look like. You will see large hydrogen projects actually come online, feeding refineries or feeding the transition to renewable diesel or biojet fuel, things that are basically decarbonized fuels that we use today. You will see changes in maritime behavior. And so getting away from some of the really crappy low sulfur fuel blends that people have tried to evolve, you will see that there'll be a difference there. So I think by 2025, you'll see some significant markers. And then clearly by 2030, there will be a number of pathways that people have tried a couple of, I don't want to call them experiments, but every market change is some kind of experiment.
Sure.
You'll see a number. So you'll see California go one way, you'll see Texas go one way, you'll see the EU try this and the UK try that. And there'll be other experiments out there that you'll see, and we'll get lessons from all of them. But I think by 25 you'll see a number of them, so that we're on our way by 2030 to actually really doing some big things.
Okay. Maybe just one thought too I've got while we're on the subject matter, but what do you see with distribution, right? The transmission line and sort of the grid here in this country. I mean, it's they're obviously very strained. It's a lot of them are very old. I mean, what comes of that kind of long term? It's something I've given some thought to, and kind of like to get your thoughts. How do we handle that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think of that as really back to that web idea, and that the rise of distributed energy resources is a big part of this. People like more local control of things. How we allow individual houses, buildings, neighborhoods participate in that distributed web. A lot of businesses are trying things there. The idea of a virtual power plant where people are aggregating, companies are aggregating lots of endpoints and are able to dispatch them or turn them up and down more as a unit. So it looks like what used to be a power plant. I think you're going to see the distribution systems become much more robust and bidirectional. I think that's a feature that the old system didn't contemplate. Old system was one way,
right?
One way power, right?
Yep.
The idea of the distribution system being much more bidirectional is going to rise. So that will be hopefully that's a good incentive for the distribution companies and distribution utilities to realize they have a very valuable asset that will get to be a home for investment and for robust shareholder returns for them.
Yeah.
I think the transmission systems will also continue to upgrade, and we'll see more interconnections between the large systems.
Okay.
I just the whole thing has got to be more robust and stronger.
Yeah.
So there's something there. The transmission models for a system like the U.S. have always been very difficult because of jurisdictions.
Yeah.
When you have a national utility like a lot of other countries do,
Right.
it's an easier process because there's one entity, one process to go through. As you know, here, if you're trying to cross from Texas to Florida, like or from Oklahoma to Florida, like some of the big high voltage lines tried to do, you're all of a sudden going through a number of states and therefore a number of utility commission jurisdictions, and any one of them can start to become a weak link in that process, and it's held up a lot of those big projects. So you haven't seen a lot of interstate transmission just because of our regulatory structures here in the U.S. I'm a little bit of a pessimist there, to be honest with you.
Well, no, but I mean, but you got a ton of experience there too, right? I mean, I'm just thinking about, some of the projects that I've been a part of on the development side. You've done a lot of development work, and, we've done some stuff in California, and those are challenging. I mean, just staying in one state, and trying to pull that off, the licensing and the permitting is a massive effort. And you're right. The minute you cross a state line, what I would say is complex gets, I don't want to say infinitely complex, but potentially, right? And then if you're crossing several state lines, boy, the likelihood gets, I think, really low for pulling it off. It makes it super tough. I
mean, there's another intersection for decarbonization that I'm finding interesting as well, and that is, how do we deal with our waste streams as a society? Waste streams that often, despite our best intentions to recycle and divert, still end up in landfills, and a lot of waste into landfills and becomes methane. A lot of it uncaptured methane, and as you know, methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. We have a lot of agricultural waste that is still taken care of through old-fashioned techniques of put it out in the field and burn it. Those things are bad for just regular air quality, things that we breathe every day, but obviously they have their own, climate impact that they're not, sort of recycling the carbon, really. They're just putting it back up. So I think you're also going to see a trend, and maybe not as strong in the US as in other places, but a trend towards using our waste more effectively to regenerate some of the fuels that we've extracted over time.
Would some of that involve like sequestering the methane and essentially?
I think it's going to be converting the methane, perhaps converting it to a hydrogen that's usable and a CO2 that's captured, right?
Okay.
I think it's converting the biomass.
Sure.
Same thing, converting it back to its component pieces and capturing the hydrogen for use, and maybe figuring out how to sequester the carbon. And I think you're going to see the landfill volumes that are still going to landfill also go through some kind of a process. That is, make a big distinction. This is not an incineration that we're talking about. This is people actually reusing the materials in a way that is fuel producing and sort of rock producing or slagging out, but you're not creating the byproducts that people historically associated with waste and incineration. So I think a lot of solutions coming out that are non-incineration options for our waste streams.
That's good. That's good. No, I appreciate you throwing that in there kind of at the very end. That's a really interesting insight. It goes fast. It goes every week. It goes so fast. There's so much more to talk about, but one of the last things I like to do too is if someone wants to get in touch with you, talk a little bit further, they heard something that really made their ears perk up, or they'd like to talk to you on the business side. What's the best way for people to get a hold of you, Rob?
I think going to LinkedIn profile, you'll be able to direct message there. You'll find contact information. So I think that's the best way for people to track me down, and you can leave a comment or a question for public as well.
Okay, excellent. Well, I can't thank you enough for making time to come on the show. It's been my honor and privilege to have you today. This is a great discussion. I got a lot of nuggets myself, so I'll be rewatching this show and, taking those into my deep work session. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure.
So I want to thank you, Rob, for coming on the show. And if you want to also come on the show and spend some time in the hot seat like Rob did today, hit us up, innergeniuspodcast.com. You see it behind me. So remember, there's a genius inside of all of us. It's up to you to discover it, harness it, and share it with the world. So the question really is this: what's your inner genius?
This is the Padua Podcast Network. PaduaPodcastNetwork.com.